Sweat trickled down the temples of a strong black man, his hands calloused by the earth. He walked through the narrow streets of Jerusalem carrying a bundle of grain over his left shoulder when he heard the cries. They were not ordinary cries. They were the howls of a crowd that seemed to have lost all form of humanity. Simon of Cyrene stopped. His eyes narrowed under the midday sun. Something was happening ahead, something that made the ground tremble beneath his feet and the air thicken like sacrificial smoke. He couldn't know that in a few minutes his entire life would be torn apart. That his hands, accustomed to tilling the land of Africa, would touch the most sacred wood in human history. That his name, unknown until that moment, would be pronounced by billions of mouths over 2,000 years. A Roman soldier saw him and pointed him out. Simon was not from Jerusalem. He came from Cyrene, a coastal city in North Africa, in the territory we now call Libya. He was a man of the land, a farmer, a manual laborer, someone whose hands knew the plow better than parchment. His dark skin bore the sun of the African desert, and his broad shoulders told the story of decades bent over the soil, planting, harvesting, surviving. He had made the long journey to Jerusalem for Passover. He was a Jew of the diaspora, one of those thousands of Israelites scattered throughout the world who maintained the faith of their fathers even far from the promised land. Cyrene had a significant Jewish community, men and women who observed the Sabbath, who taught the Torah to their children, who dreamed of the day when the Messiah would restore Israel. Simon was one of them, not a rabbi, not a priest, not a scribe, just an ordinary man with a quiet faith. The journey from Cyrene to Jerusalem was no simple one. It involved hundreds of kilometers by sea and land, weeks of travel, passing through Alexandria, crossing the Sinai desert, and climbing the hills of Judea. Simon made this journey with a purpose. He wanted to be in the temple during Passover. He wanted to offer his sacrifice, sing the Psalms with his brothers, and feel part of something greater than his small existence in Cyrene. He arrived in Jerusalem the day before and stayed on the outskirts of the city, probably with other African pilgrims who shared the same language, the same customs, the same longing for home. That morning he woke up early, he washed his face, put on his traveling tunic, placed the bundle of grain on his shoulder, perhaps provisions for the feast days, perhaps goods to trade, and walked toward the city gates. Jerusalem was different that morning. There was a tension in the air that Simon couldn't explain. The merchants at the gates spoke in whispers. Women covered their faces and quickened their pace. Children were pulled inside their houses. Something had happened during the night, something involving the Sanhedrin, the Romans, and a man named Jesus of Nazareth. Simon had heard of that name. Who hadn't? Even in Cyrene, news reached him about the Galilean who healed the blind, raised the dead, and challenged the powerful. Some said he was the Messiah. Others said he was a dangerous blasphemer. Simon had never taken a position on this. He was a practical man, more concerned with the next harvest than with theological debates. But now, walking through the streets of Jerusalem, he began to sense that something far greater than a religious dispute was at play. The air was heavy. The sky seemed too low. And those screams, those horrible screams, were getting closer and closer. Simon turned a corner and saw the crowd. Hundreds of people huddled along the sides of a narrow street, some shouting insults, others crying, others simply watching with empty eyes. And in the center of that human corridor, a staggering figure. A man covered in blood dragged a wooden beam across his shoulders. His back was raw, literally torn apart by Roman flogging. A crown of thorns embedded in his scalp caused blood to stream down his face, partially blinding his eyes. His legs trembled with every step. He fell, got up, fell again. Simon stood paralyzed. He had seen crucifixions before. The Romans performed them with frightening frequency. But there was something about this man that was different. It wasn't just the physical suffering, which was monstrous. It was something else. It was his gaze. When the condemned man raised his eyes for a moment, Simon felt as if the whole world had stopped. There was no hatred in that gaze. There was no despair, no anger, not even self-pity. There was something Simon had never seen in any human being before. an impossible peace in the midst of impossible pain. And it was at that moment that the Roman soldier saw him. The centurion responsible for the escort had a practical problem. The condemned man wouldn't be able to reach Golgotha carrying the cross. He had already fallen 3 times. The man was dying even before being crucified, and Rome demanded that the execution be public on top of the hill for everyone to see. He needed someone to carry that piece of wood. His eyes scanned the crowd and stopped on Simon. A tall, strong man, clearly a foreigner, therefore without local connections that could cause political problems. Perfect. You, the African, come here. Simon felt his blood run cold. The bundle of grain fell from his shoulders and scattered across the stone floor. He looked around, hoping the soldier was talking to someone else, but the spear was already pointed directly at his chest. Grab this piece of wood, now. It wasn't a request. It was a Roman military order, and disobeying meant death. Simon had no choice, but something inside him, something he couldn't explain in 1,000 years, made his feet move, not just out of fear, but something more, something that came from a place deeper than the instinct for survival. He approached the bloodied man. The smell of blood and sweat was overwhelming. The wood of the cross was soaked, slippery, heavy as the whole world. Simon knelt down, placed his hands on the beam, and when his fingers touched that wood, he felt a shock run through his entire body. It wasn't electricity, it wasn't pain. It was as if, in that touch, he had touched something that existed before time and that would continue to exist after everything was over. It was as if that ordinary piece of wood, cut from any tree by any carpenter, carried within it the weight of all the tears ever shed, of all the sins ever committed, of all the pain ever felt by every human being who has ever walked on this planet. Simon lifted the cross onto his African shoulders, and he began to walk alongside Jesus of Nazareth. Perhaps as you listen to this story, something has stirred within you. A restlessness, a question you can't quite formulate, but that you feel like Simon felt when he touched that piece of wood. And that's exactly where many get lost, because this restlessness isn't random. It's a sign that there's something in recent events that you haven't yet been able to connect with your own life. Look, Simon was an ordinary man. He wasn't prepared. He didn't understand what was happening, and yet he was called to the center of the greatest story ever told. Does that tell you anything? Not everyone realizes this, but Revelation wasn't written just for theologians or pastors. It was written for people like Simon, people like you, people who are living their normal lives while something monumental unfolds around them. If you feel you need to understand what's coming, if you notice the signs multiplying and want to know what they really mean, I've prepared something that can transform how you see all of this. It's the digital book revealing the secrets of the apocalypse, a resource that is helping thousands of people understand the prophecies that are being fulfilled right now. But I need to be transparent with you. It won't be available for long. Check the first pinned comment to see how to secure your copy. And if this message resonated with you, leave an amen in the comments. I want to know you're here, walking this journey together. Each step felt like an eternity. Simon walked behind Jesus, but the crossbeam stretched between them like a bridge, a physical connection between the African man and the man from Nazareth. The weight was real, concrete, crushing. The wood scraped Simon's shoulder through his tunic, opening wounds in flesh that hours before had been intact. But the physical weight was only the most superficial layer of what Simon carried. With every meter he traveled, he felt something he couldn't name. It was as if the wood transmitted not only its own weight, but the weight of something invisible, something spiritual, something that made his soul groan as if it were being crushed between 2 millstones. He didn't understand. How could he? He was a farmer from Cyrene, not a prophet. The streets of Jerusalem narrowed as they climbed toward Golgotha. The stone walls reflected the cries of the crowd, amplifying the sound until it seemed to come from all directions at once. Women wept at the windows. Children hid behind their mothers. Old men shook their heads silently, some murmuring prayers, others simply gazing with eyes that had already seen too much horror in this life. Simon looked at Jesus whenever he could. The man in front of him walked with a determination that defied all logic. His body was ravaged. Roman flogging was designed to bring the victim to the brink of life and death. His back was a mass of exposed flesh. His arms trembled. His bare feet left bloodstains on the stones. And yet he kept walking. "Why don't you scream?" Simon thought, not daring to say it aloud. Any other man would be begging for mercy. Anyone else would be cursing their torturers. But you walk as if you were going somewhere you chose to go. That was the part that didn't make sense. Those condemned to crucifixion were dragged, not walked. They were pushed with spears, whipped to move forward, treated like animals being led to the slaughter. But Jesus, though he could barely stand, moved forward with an intentionality that seemed to come from within, not from without. At one point, Jesus stumbled on a stone and fell to his knees. The crowd let out a cry, part scorn, part horror. The soldiers advanced with whips, but before they could use them, Simon did something instinctive. He bent down, supported the extra weight of the cross with his whole body, and waited. He gave Jesus time to get up without the pressure of the wood on his wounded back. It was a small gesture, almost invisible in the chaos of that procession. But Jesus turned his face back for a moment and looked at Simon. And in that look, which lasted less than a second, Simon saw something that forever changed the geography of his soul: gratitude. Not the superficial gratitude of someone receiving a favor, but the profound gratitude of someone recognizing a brother. As if Jesus were saying without words, "I know what you are carrying. I know it is more than wood, and I thank you for being here." Simon felt his eyes burning. He swallowed hard. He tightened his grip on the wood and continued walking. The Via Dolorosa snaked uphill. The sun was almost at its highest point in the sky, and the Jerusalem heat in April was merciless. Simon's mouth was as dry as the desert from which he had come. The sweat mixed with Jesus' blood, which ran down the wood to Simon's hands, created a sticky substance that made every movement more difficult. Along the way, faces appeared and disappeared like ghosts. A man spat in Jesus' direction and hit Simon in the face. A woman threw herself to her knees and spread out a cloth. Simon never knew her name, but tradition would call her Veronica. Children screamed, not understanding what was happening. Roman soldiers marched with the indifference of those performing a bureaucratic routine. For them, it was just another Friday at work. Simon watched everything with the eyes of someone daydreaming. Nothing seemed real. Hours ago, he was an anonymous pilgrim, buying grain at the market. Now he was at the center of a death procession, carrying the instrument of execution for a man whom half of Jerusalem called king and the other half called a criminal. He thought of his sons, Alexander and Rufus, 2 boys who were somewhere in Jerusalem at that moment, probably waiting for their father to return with provisions for the Passover feast. What would they think if they saw him now? Covered in someone else's blood, bent under a cross, surrounded by soldiers? Would they feel shame, fear, or something else? Simon could not have known that years later his 2 sons would become well-known figures in the early church, that the Apostle Paul would mention Rufus by name in his letter to the Romans, calling him chosen in the Lord, that the seed planted on that bloody journey would germinate into a tree that would cover the world with its shade. But at that moment all Simon knew was the weight of the wood, the weight of the blood, the weight of being present at something that was too great for one man alone. And yet his feet kept moving one after the other, climbing the hill that the whole world would come to call Calvary. The crowd thickened as they approached the top. Pharisees and Sadducees watched from the sides with barely disguised satisfaction. Some had actively participated in the condemnation. Others simply watched, relieved that they were not the target of Roman fury that day. Pontius Pilate had washed his hands, literally, and delivered Jesus to the will of the mob. Simon reflected on how cowardice had many faces. There was the cowardice of Pilate, who knew the man was innocent but didn't want to face political pressure. There was the cowardice of the disciples, who fled the night before when Jesus was arrested in Gethsemane. There was the cowardice of the crowd, who 5 days earlier shouted, "Hosanna," and now shouted, "Crucify him," with the same mouth. And there was the quiet courage of an African foreigner carrying a cross without being asked why. There are burdens that the shoulders carry, and there are burdens that the soul bears. Simon was discovering that the difference between the two was smaller than he had imagined. The cross on his shoulders was physical: wood, nails, plant fiber. But what passed through his spirit on that path was something that transcended any materiality. With each step up the hill, Simon of Cyrene began to realize that he wasn't just carrying an instrument of torture, he was participating in something alive, pulsating, that moved between him and the bloodied man before him like an invisible current of spiritual energy. He began to remember. He remembered the first time he heard the word Messiah in Cyrene. He was a boy. His grandfather, a devout Jew who had never set foot in Jerusalem but dreamed of it every night, would sit under an olive tree and tell stories. Moses and the parting of the sea, David and the fallen giant, Elijah and the fire that descended from heaven. And always, always the promise, one day he who will deliver Israel will come. One day the anointed one will come, and when he comes, everything will change. The grandfather died without seeing this day. Simon's father died without seeing this day. And Simon had lived 40-odd years thinking that he too would die without seeing this day. But now, walking behind the condemned man, covered in that man's blood, feeling the weight that this man could no longer carry alone, a terrible question began to form in the back of his mind. What if it's him? Simon shook his head as if to banish the thought. It was absurd. The Messiah would be a king, a conqueror, someone who would come with heavenly armies to crush the Romans and restore the throne of David. He wouldn't be a Galilean carpenter being dragged to his death like a common thief. What if it's him? The question returned more insistent. Simon looked at Jesus again. The man stumbled, but did not fall this time. His lips moved silently. Was he praying? Was he delirious with pain? Was he speaking to someone no one else could see? Simon thought of the prophets. Isaiah chapter 53. The words he had heard so many times in the synagogue of Cyrene came flooding back to his mind. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. His hands gripped the wood tighter. His heart raced. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Every word of Isaiah's prophecy seemed to describe exactly what Simon was seeing. Exactly. As if the prophet had been there, on that street, 700 years before and had described the scene with photographic precision. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. Simon felt tears streaming down his face, not from pain, not from fear, but from a terrible and wonderful understanding at the same time. An understanding that did not come from the mind, but from somewhere deeper, from the place where the soul finds God without needing words. He said nothing. What could he say? He was surrounded by Roman soldiers, a hostile crowd, and priests who had condemned the man to death. Any show of sympathy for the condemned man could cost him his own life. But inside, Simon of Cyrene was being demolished and rebuilt at the same time. Every certainty he had about God, about the Messiah, about the divine plan, was being shattered like a clay pot struck by a hammer. And in the shards, something new was beginning to form. Something he didn't have the vocabulary to describe, something that centuries later would be called faith. The path grew steeper. The crowd pressed against the walls. The sun burned mercilessly, and Simon carried on. He carried the wood, he carried his grandfather's memories, he carried Isaiah's prophecy, he carried the question he dared not answer aloud. What if it's him? Around them, the visible world continued its spectacle of cruelty. Soldiers laughed, religious figures mocked. The crowd oscillated between morbid curiosity and overt sadism. But in the invisible world, in that space between heaven and earth, where angels and demons wage battles unseen by human eyes, something monumental was happening. Because Simon didn't know it, but every step he took carrying that cross was being recorded, not only in the Gospels that would be written decades later, but in the very fabric of eternity. That simple man, that unknown African, that farmer with calloused hands was, unknowingly, participating in the most important moment in the history of the universe. And the weight he carried on his shoulders was, in fact, the weight that the whole world should have carried, but couldn't. The hill of Golgotha was near. Simon could see the summit, a rocky elevation, devoid of vegetation, with the grotesque shape that gave it its name, place of the skull. Posts were already in the ground, awaiting the horizontal beams. Soldiers were already preparing the nails. Other condemned men were already being dragged to the same fate, but Simon hardly noticed these things. His eyes were fixed on the back of the man in front of him. Jesus' back was a scene of horror. The Roman flagrum, the whip with metal and bone tips, had torn the flesh to shreds. Muscles and tendons were exposed. Blood had clotted in some areas and continued to flow in others, creating a red and black map on skin that had once been intact. Simon thought about how many lashes that body had received. Jewish tradition limited it to 39. But the Romans did not follow Jewish tradition. The Romans beat until they were tired, or until the condemned lost consciousness, or until the officer gave the order to stop. Some historians would later estimate that Jesus received more than 100 blows that morning, and yet he kept walking. Simon began to pay attention to the other characters in that macabre procession. There were 2 other condemned men, thieves, so they said. One of them was cursing the soldiers with impressive creativity. The other walked in silence, his eyes fixed on the ground, as if he had already accepted his fate. There were the women. A group of them followed the procession at a distance, weeping openly. Simon recognized the type of weeping. It wasn't the professional lament of mourners. It was the real pain of those who loved the condemned man. Among them, an older woman walked with a dignity that contrasted violently with the chaos around her. Her eyes were dry, but her face carried a pain so profound it seemed capable of cracking the very earth. Simon didn't know who she was. But it was Mary, the mother of Jesus. The woman who, 33 years earlier, had heard from an angel that her son would be called Son of the Most High, and that his kingdom would have no end. The woman who had kept all these things in her heart, meditating on them in silence, and who now saw that same son destroyed before her eyes. There was something in Mary's face that Simon instantly recognized. Because he was a father, too, it was helplessness. The devastating helplessness of seeing his son suffer and being unable to do absolutely anything. Simon thought of Alexander and Rufus again. If they were there, in that place, what would he do? The answer was simple and terrible. Anything. He would do anything. He would kill, he would die. He would destroy the whole world if necessary. But Maria didn't destroy anything. Maria walked. Maria bore witness. Maria endured a pain that no poet could ever translate into words. At a certain point along the way, Jesus stopped. Not because the soldiers ordered him to, but because something caught his attention. He turned to the group of weeping women and spoke. His voice was hoarse, almost inaudible, worn by thirst and suffering, but each word carried an authority that made even the soldiers hesitate. Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children. Simon listened to every word, and he was stunned. That man, tortured, humiliated, on his way to the most cruel death that human engineering had ever invented, was consoling other people. He wasn't asking for pity. He was offering it. If they do these things when the wood is green, what will they do when it is dry? Simon felt a chill run down his spine. The words were enigmatic, almost prophetic. What did green wood mean? What did dry wood mean? He didn't know, but he felt there was a warning in those words. A warning about something to come. Something terrible. Something that would affect Jerusalem, Israel, the whole world. Decades later, when Titus's legions ravaged Jerusalem in 70 AD, destroying the temple and massacring hundreds of thousands of Jews, the survivors would remember those words. If they do this to the green wood, if they do this to the innocent, to the righteous, to the Son of God, what will they do to the guilty? What will happen to those who rejected mercy when it walked among them? But Simon, at that moment, did not know the future. He only knew the present, the overwhelming, unbearable, sacred present. The procession resumed its movement. The soldiers pushed Jesus forward. Simon adjusted the cross on his shoulders and continued. The top of Golgotha was just a few meters away, and with each step, the reality of what was about to happen became more concrete, more inevitable, more terrifying. Simon looked at the sky. It was getting dark. It wasn't the natural darkening of dusk. It was something else. The clouds were thickening abnormally, as if the sun itself refused to witness what was about to happen. A cold breeze, impossible at that time of day, at that time of year, began to blow from the east, carrying a scent that Simon couldn't identify. It smelled of damp earth, of burning incense, of something ancient. It smelled of eternity. Golgotha was not a mountain. It was a low, rocky hill, deformed by erosion into shapes that, from certain angles, resembled a human skull. The Romans had chosen that place for executions for two practical reasons. It was visible from afar, serving as a warning to anyone who thought of challenging Rome, and it was outside the city walls, preventing the impurity of death from contaminating Jerusalem during religious festivals. When Simon reached the top, carrying the horizontal beam of the cross, his shoulders ached in pain. But the physical pain was a murmur compared to the cry of his soul, because now he saw the final preparations. The soldiers spread the tools on the ground with the bureaucratic efficiency of those who do this every day. Iron nails as long as the palm of a hand, a heavy hammer, ropes, a wooden plaque with an inscription that was still being painted. A centurion ripped the cross from Simon's shoulders with a brusque tug. "Go," he said, without even looking at him. To the soldier, Simon was a tool that had served its purpose, as disposable as the nails and ropes. Simon took a few steps back, but he didn't leave. His feet refused to move from that place. Something held him there, like an invisible anchor stuck in the rocky ground of Golgotha. He watched as the soldiers tore off Jesus' clothes. The tunic, woven from a single piece, without seams, a detail that the evangelists would record, and that centuries of theologians would interpret as a symbol of the indivisible unity of Christ's work, clung to the wounds on his back. When they pulled it off, they took with it pieces of coagulated flesh, reopening each wound of the flagrum. Jesus arched his body in pain, but did not cry out. Simon clenched his fists. Inside him, a primal fury fought against his impotence. He was strong. He was a man accustomed to physical labor, to battling the elements, to endurance. His arms could take down any one of those soldiers individually, but there were dozens of them, armed, trained, with no emotional connection to the man they were about to nail to a cross. And there was something else. Something Simon perceived but couldn't articulate. Jesus didn't want to be rescued. That march, that suffering, that death, they weren't accidents. They were choices. Simon didn't know how he knew this, but he did. In the same way he knew when the rain would come for his crops in Cyrene, not through meteorological analysis, but through a sixth sense forged in experience and intuition. Jesus lay down on the wood willingly. He stretched out his arms over the horizontal beam, the same beam that Simon had carried for hundreds of meters. His fingers spread, exposing his palms. The first nail was in place. The soldier held the hammer. Simon closed his eyes. The sound echoed through Golgotha like a dry thunderclap. Metal against flesh against wood. Once, twice, 3 times, 4. The sound of the blows was so violent, so definitive that even some of the most experienced soldiers looked away. Simon opened his eyes when the sound stopped. Jesus was nailed. His arms were outstretched on the horizontal beam, fastened at the wrists, not at the palms, as sacred art would show centuries later, but at the wrists, where the bone could support the weight of the body without tearing. His feet were overlapping, pierced by a single long nail against the vertical post. The cross was erected. The soldiers wedged it into the prepared hole in the rocky ground. Jesus' body swayed with the impact, and each movement sent waves of pain through the piercing points. Gravity, that silent force that keeps planets in their orbits and oceans in their beds, was now the most efficient instrument of torture in the universe. Each breath required Jesus to push his body upward using his nailed feet, momentarily relieving the pressure on his diaphragm, only to fall again when the pain in his feet became unbearable. Simon watched this mechanical cycle of survival with a mixture of horror and reverence. He was witnessing the most famous death in history, but at that moment he didn't know it. To him, it was simply the death of a man. The slow, public, agonizing death of a man he had touched, whose cross he had carried, whose blood was still on his hands. The plaque above Jesus' head was finally affixed. Simon read the words in 3 languages, Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. The priests protested. Do not write King of the Jews, but rather that he said he was the King of the Jews. Pilate refused. What I have written, I have written. Simon looked at the plaque and pondered the irony. Pilate, who believed in nothing except the power of Rome, had written the deepest truth in human history. Unknowingly, unintentionally, without understanding, the Roman governor had made a theological statement that would echo through eternity. Jesus was the king, not the king they expected, not a king of swords and armies, but the king they needed, the king who chose to reign from a cross. The sun disappeared. Not gradually, as happens at twilight, but abruptly, violently, as if someone had blown out the largest lamp in the universe. At midday, the brightest time of day in Jerusalem, darkness fell over the city like a veil of mourning. Simon looked up at the sky in terror. This was unnatural. It wasn't an eclipse. He knew about eclipses. He knew they couldn't happen during the full moon of Easter. It wasn't clouds. The air was dry and still. It was something different. It was as if nature itself were in agony, as if the sun refused to illuminate what the men were doing on that hill. The darkness lasted 3 hours, 3 hours in which time seemed to stand still, in which sounds faded, in which even the most hardened soldiers felt fear. In the Gospels, this period would be recorded in a few lines, but for those who were there, for Simon, for Mary, for the few who remained, every minute of those 3 hours was a compressed eternity. In the darkness, the sounds became more present. Simon heard Jesus' muffled groans with each attempt to breathe. He heard the murmur of the 2 thieves crucified beside him, one cursing, the other weeping. He heard the clinking of the soldiers' armor as they threw dice at the condemned man's clothes, indifferent to the cosmic drama unfolding above their heads. And he heard the voices of those who mocked him. He saved others, but he cannot save himself. The priests shouted this with almost obscene glee. If he is the King of Israel, let him come down from the cross now, and we will believe in him. Simon felt bile rising in his throat. The hypocrisy of those religious men was so thick it seemed to have a physical consistency. They were the guardians of the law, the interpreters of the scriptures, those who supposedly knew God better than anyone. And there they were, mocking a dying man, provoking the suffering of others with the same mouths they used to recite the Psalms in the temple. Simon reflected on how many times religion has served as a mask for cruelty. How many times men have used God's name to justify the exact opposite of what God asked. How many times orthodoxy has become a weapon against mercy. On the cross beside them, one of the thieves joined the chorus of mockery. If you are the Christ, save yourself and us. But the other thief, the one who had been silent, spoke, and his words cut through the darkness like a blade. Don't you fear God? We are receiving what we deserve for our actions, but this man has done nothing wrong. Simon's eyes widened. That thief, a convicted criminal, a man who lived on the fringes of the law, someone society considered human garbage, was doing what the priests, the scribes, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees hadn't dared to do. He was defending Jesus. He was acknowledging the innocence of the man on the middle cross. And then the thief did something even more extraordinary. He turned to Jesus and said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. In your kingdom. A man nailed to a cross, dying beside another man nailed to a cross, speaking of a kingdom. It was the most absurd and powerful declaration of faith Simon had ever heard, because there was nothing, absolutely nothing in the visible scene that justified believing that this tortured and dying man possessed any kingdom. It was pure faith. Raw faith, stripped of evidence, planted not in logic, but in something the thief had perceived looking at Jesus. The same thing Simon had perceived on the Via Dolorosa. Jesus' answer came immediately, clearly, definitively, despite the agony. Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. Today? Not tomorrow? Not in some distant future, not after a period of purification. Today, on that day, on that Friday of blood and darkness and pain, paradise. Simon felt his knees weaken. He fell onto the stones of Golgotha, not caring who saw him. His hands, the same hands that had held the cross, opened in an involuntary gesture of surrender. It was not a conscious religious gesture. It was the physical reaction of a soul that was being crushed and rebuilt at the same time. The darkness continued. The wind blew in cold gusts that did not belong to that season. And over the city of Jerusalem, the angels fell silent. Did you notice? Did you realize what just happened in this story? A thief, someone the whole world would discard, received the promise of paradise. And Simon, a foreigner, an African, someone who wasn't part of Jesus' inner circle, became part of the salvation story. This is no coincidence. This is a direct message for whoever is listening now. When this starts to make sense in your life, everything changes. The prophecies of Revelation are not ancient and distant texts. They are maps for what is happening now at this very moment, and it may be too late for those who ignore the signs. Thousands of people have already transformed their understanding of the end times with the digital book, revealing the secrets of Revelation. But I'll be direct with you. Access to this material is for a limited time, and once it's removed, it won't return. If you feel it's time to understand what God is revealing to this generation, check the first pinned comment. Everything you need is there. And if this story is touching your heart, write Amen in the comments. It's not just a word. It's a declaration that you are attentive to what the Spirit is saying. 3 hours of darkness, 180 minutes in which the world hung suspended between life and death, between heaven and hell, between before and after. Simon remained on Golgotha for all that time, unable to move, trapped by a force he could not name. And then at the end of the 9th hour, 3 o'clock in the afternoon by the modern clock, Jesus opened his mouth and let out a cry that tore the fabric of reality. Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani? The Aramaic words echoed through Golgotha with a power that defied the shattered body from which they came. My God, why have you forsaken me? It was the beginning of Psalm 22, a psalm written by David 1,000 years earlier, which described in astonishing detail a crucifixion that the poet-king could never have witnessed. Because crucifixion did not even exist as a method of execution in his time, Simon knew the psalm. Every devout Jew knew it. They pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my clothes among themselves and cast lots for my tunic. He looked at the soldiers who, at that very moment, were gambling for Jesus' clothes. He looked at his pierced hands and feet. He looked at the body hanging from the cross, every bone visible beneath the stretched skin. David's prophecy was being fulfilled, detail by detail, bone by bone, nail by nail, before his very eyes. Some in the crowd hearing Eli mistook it for Elijah. He's calling Elijah. Wait, let's see if Elijah comes to save him. The ignorance or malice disguised as ignorance continued until the very last minute. A soldier soaked a sponge in vinegar, attached it to a hyssop stalk, and brought it to Jesus' lips. The gesture seemed merciful, but it was actually a common practice to prolong the agony of the crucified. The sour liquid moistened the parched throat enough to keep the person conscious for longer. Jesus tasted the vinegar, and then he spoke again. This time, his voice was not a cry of abandonment. It was a declaration. It is finished. 2 words in Portuguese, a single word in the original Greek, tetelestai, and that word carried a meaning that pierced layers of reality like a fiery sword. Tetelestai was the term merchants used when a debt was paid in full. It was stamped on receipts when the total amount was settled. It's paid. It's complete. It's finished. Nothing more is owed. Simon didn't speak Greek, but he felt the weight of that statement. It wasn't the groan of a dying man surrendering to death. It was the victory cry of a warrior who had just won the most important battle of all wars. It was the sound of a door being opened, a door that had been locked since Eden, since Adam and Eve were expelled from the garden, since an angel with a flaming sword blocked the way back to paradise. Jesus bowed his head and gave up his spirit. What happened next was recorded in the Gospels with the economy of words, typical of ancient writers, but every detail deserves to be expanded upon, because every detail was a spiritual earthquake. The veil of the temple was torn, from top to bottom. This detail is crucial. The veil of the temple was a massive curtain. According to historians, it was approximately 18 meters high, 9 meters wide, and the thickness of a palm. It was woven with threads of linen, blue, purple, and scarlet. It separated the Holy of Holies, the place where the presence of God dwelt, from the rest of the temple. Only the high priest could cross that veil, and only once a year on the Day of Atonement, carrying sacrificial blood. When it was torn from top to bottom, the message was unequivocal. God tore down the barrier, not man God. The separation between the divine and the human, which had existed since the fall, was eliminated, not by human effort, not by religious merit, not by animal sacrifice. By the sacrifice of a man, the earth shook, rocks split, and according to Matthew, tombs opened and the bodies of saints who had died were resurrected, appearing in Jerusalem after the resurrection of Jesus. Simon felt the ground tremble beneath his feet. Literally, the earthquake was real, physical, measurable. The stones of Golgotha vibrated and fissures opened in the rocky ground. Some in the crowd screamed in fear and fled. Others fell to their knees. The Roman centurion, the same kind of man who had ordered Simon to carry the cross, the same kind of soldier who had hammered in the nails and thrown dice for the clothes, looked at Jesus' body on the cross and uttered the most unexpected words ever to come out of the mouth of a pagan soldier. Truly, this was the Son of God? Simon listened, and deep within his soul, where the question he had carried since the Via Dolorosa still burned, the answer finally arrived. Not as an intellectual conclusion, but as an absolute certainty that settled into every fiber of his being. It was him. It was him from the beginning. It was him whom Moses announced. It was him whom Isaiah described. It was him whom the prophets saw in night visions. It was him whom Simon's grandfather awaited under the olive tree in Cyrene. The Messiah did not come with heavenly armies. He came with nails in his hands. He did not come to destroy the Romans. He came to destroy death. He did not come to sit on a golden throne. He came to die on a wooden cross, the same wood that Simon had carried. The body was taken down from the cross before sunset. Jewish law required that the dead be buried before the Sabbath, and that week's Sabbath was special. It was Passover Sabbath, one of the holiest days on the calendar. Even the Roman executioners respected this detail, not out of religious respect, but out of political pragmatism. It wasn't worth provoking a riot over a corpse. Simon watched from a distance as two wealthy men, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, came forward to claim the body. Joseph was a member of the Sanhedrin who had silently disagreed with the condemnation. Nicodemus was the Pharisee who, months earlier, had sought out Jesus at night for a private conversation. Both were what we might call closet believers, men who recognized something special in Jesus but lacked the courage to publicly assert their views. Death, it seems, gave them that courage. Joseph offered his own tomb, a cave carved into the rock, new, never used, in a garden near Golgotha. Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, approximately 30 kilograms of spices, an absurdly generous amount that would normally be reserved for the burial of kings. Simon watched as they wrapped Jesus' body in linen cloths, alternating layers of fabric and spices, following Jewish funerary custom. He watched as the circular stone, weighing perhaps 2 tons, was rolled away to close the entrance to the tomb. He watched as Mary, Jesus' mother, and Mary Magdalene sat facing the sepulchre, refusing to leave, keeping vigil over a body they loved and which was now cold. And then Simon left. Not because he wanted to, because he didn't know what else to do. He walked through the streets of Jerusalem like a man in shock. His shoulders still ached from the weight of the cross. His hands were still stained with dried blood, the blood of Jesus mixed with his own sweat. His clothes were torn and dirty. He smelled of death. But inside him something pulsed, something alive, warm, inexplicable, like an ember buried under ashes, invisible from the outside, but incandescent inside. Simon found his sons at nightfall. Alexander and Rufus were worried. Their father had left in the morning to buy grain and hadn't returned. When they saw him in that state, they were frightened. "Dad, what happened?" "You're bleeding." "It's not my blood," Simon replied. And he remained silent for a long time before he could say anything more. Easter Saturday was the longest day of Simon's life. He observed the rituals, ate the ceremonial meal, sang the psalms he knew by heart. But his mind was elsewhere. It was on Golgotha. It was on the Via Dolorosa. It was in the moment when his fingers touched the wood of the cross and something invisible pierced him like a lightning bolt. That night, lying on the hard floor of the inn, listening to the breathing of his children sleeping beside him, Simon did the only thing a man can do when everything he thought he knew has been turned upside down. He prayed, not with the formal prayers of the synagogue, not with the rehearsed words of the liturgy, with raw, disorganized, desperate words that came from the same place where the tears had flowed on the Via Dolorosas. God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, I don't understand. I don't understand what happened today. I don't understand why I was there. I don't understand why the Lord allowed him to die like that. I don't understand anything. A pause, a gasp of breath. But I know what I saw. I saw something in that man's eyes that doesn't exist in any other human being. I carried his cross, and the cross carried something inside me. I don't know what it is, but I know I'm different. I know I'll never be the same again. Another pause. The silence of the Jerusalem night seemed deeper than usual. Even the dogs had stopped barking. If he was who I think he was, if he really was the Messiah, then the Lord has just done the strangest, most incomprehensible, most terrifying thing he has ever done since the creation of the world. The Lord sent his own son to die as a criminal, and I, Simon of Cyrene, a worthless farmer, I carried his cross. The last sentence came out as a whisper. What does this mean, Lord? What does this mean to me? Silence answered. But it wasn't the empty silence of absence, it was the dense silence of a presence, the silence of someone who is so close that they don't need to speak. Simon fell asleep with his hands still stained with blood. And while he slept, the city of Jerusalem was experiencing the most tense Sabbath in its history. The priests who had plotted Jesus' death were nervous. They had heard rumors that he had promised to rise again on the third day and had asked Pilate to place guards at the tomb. The disciples were hiding, locked in a house, terrified by the possibility of being next. The women were preparing extra spices to return to the tomb as soon as the Sabbath was over. And in the tomb, behind the 2-ton stone, guarded by Roman soldiers trained to kill, the body of the man called Jesus of Nazareth lay motionless in the cold darkness of the rock. But something was stirring. Not in the tomb, in the universe, in the depths of existence where time and eternity meet, where the visible and the invisible are one and the same, where God does things that no human mind can imagine. Something was moving. The sun rose differently on Sunday. Simon noticed this even before opening his eyes. The light coming through the crack in the window had a quality he had never seen before. It was cleaner, more intense, as if the air had been washed during the night. He stood up, his body aching. His shoulders protested as he dressed. The marks from the crossbeam were there, dark against his skin. They would remain for weeks, perhaps months. Physical wounds that told the story words couldn't. Jerusalem awoke strangely silent. After the chaos of Friday and the tension of Saturday, the city seemed exhausted. But this silence did not last. The first rumors began circulating before dawn on Tuesday. Women were running through the streets, eyes wide and voices trembling, saying impossible things. The tomb is empty. The stone has been removed. There were angels. Simon listened to these accounts with a racing heart. He was in the marketplace when 2 men walked by arguing loudly. That's a lie. The disciples must have stolen the body during the night. With Roman guards at the gate? Impossible. No group of fishermen from Galilee is capable of confronting armed legionaries. So what happened? I don't know, but something happened. Simon dropped what he was doing and walked toward the burial site. He didn't run. Simon wasn't the type of man who ran. He walked with the slow, steady determination of someone who had plowed 1,000 hectares of land. But inside, every fiber of his being vibrated with an anxiety he had never felt before. When he arrived at the garden where Joseph of Arimathea's tomb was located, he found a chaotic scene. Roman soldiers, the very ones who should have been guarding the sepulchre, had disappeared. The stone, that 2-ton rock that sealed the entrance, was rolled aside. Not pushed, rolled, as if invisible hands had moved it with the ease of someone moving a curtain. And the tomb was empty. The linen bandages that had wrapped the body were there, intact, laid out where the body had been, like a butterfly's shell after metamorphosis. The shroud that had covered the face was folded separately, placed in a corner with a care that tomb robbers would never have. Simon entered the tomb. The air inside was cool, but not cold. It smelled of myrrh and aloes, but also of something else, something he recognized instantly, because he had smelled that same scent at Golgotha when the wind blew from the east. It smelled like eternity. Again. He ran his hand over the linen bandages. They were intact, not torn, not unraveled, but simply empty, as if the body had passed through them. Simon knew linen. He worked with natural fibers in Cyrene. He knew it was impossible to remove a body wrapped in bandages without disrupting them, especially bandages bound together with 30 pounds of myrrh and aloes, unless the body hadn't been removed but transformed, unless something had happened to that body that transcended all known laws of nature. Simon left the tomb with trembling legs. He sat down on a stone in the garden and stayed there for a long time, looking at the empty entrance of the sepulchre. In the hours and days that followed, the accounts multiplied. Mary Magdalene claimed to have seen Jesus alive, standing in the garden, and that she had initially mistaken him for the gardener. 2 disciples walking to Emmaus said that a stranger had joined them on the road, and that, when he broke bread, they recognized Jesus, who then disappeared. The apostles, locked in that house for fear of the Jews, swore that Jesus had appeared in their midst, passing through closed walls, showing the nail marks in his hands. Simon listened attentively to each account, and he did not doubt, not because he was credulous or naive. He was a practical man, accustomed to evaluating concrete facts, but because he had carried that cross, he had felt what emanated from that wood. He had looked into the eyes of Jesus on the Via Dolorosa and seen something that did not belong to this world. If that man was able to walk towards death with peace in his eyes, he was able to conquer death with the same peace. Simon gathered his sons together that night. Alexander and Rufus sat before their father with the solemnity of those who sense that something great is about to be said. Children, I need to tell you what happened on Friday, and I need you to listen not just with your ears, but with your soul. And Simon told everything: the crowd, the soldier, the cross, the weight, Jesus' gaze, the blood, the cry, the darkness, the earthquake. He told about the thief who received the promise of paradise, about the veil of the temple torn from top to bottom, about the Roman centurion who declared that this man was the Son of God. And today, Simon concluded, the tomb is empty. He has risen, children. I don't know how. I can't explain it, but I know that he has risen, because I carried his cross, and the cross showed me that he was not just a man. He was the Son of the living God. Alexander and Rufus listened in silence, and that night in the city of Jerusalem, the family of Simon of Cyrene became followers of Jesus Christ. Years passed. Simon returned to Cyrene with his sons, but he was no longer the same man who had set out for Jerusalem. The outward journey had been that of an ordinary religious pilgrim. The return journey was that of an apostle, not in the formal sense, not with a title or institutional authority, but in the original sense of the word. Someone who was sent, someone who carries a message, someone who saw something that he cannot help but tell. In Cyrene, Simon told his story. He told it in the synagogue, in the squares, in the fields, in the houses of his neighbors. He told it to those who wanted to listen and to those who didn't. And the story of a man who carried Christ's cross had a power that no theological argument could match, because it was real, concrete, embodied. Simon could show the scars on his shoulders. He could show his stained hands that, even after being washed, seemed to carry a red shadow that wouldn't completely disappear. The Jewish community of Cyrene was divided, as was to be expected. Some believed. Others considered Simon a fool, or worse, a blasphemer who was confusing a false Messiah with the true one. There were heated arguments, family rifts, and broken friendships, but the seed had been planted, and seeds planted in blood grow in ways no one can predict. The book of Acts mentions that among the early leaders of the church in Antioch, the city that would become the nerve center of Christianity in the first centuries, were men from Cyrene. Lucius of Cyrene is mentioned by name. It is reasonable, though not provable, that the faith of these men was directly linked to the testimony of Simon. Mark the evangelist, when writing his gospel, probably the first to be written, made a point of including a detail that none of the other evangelists included. When mentioning Simon of Cyrene, Mark added, "father of Alexander and Rufus." This seemingly trivial detail was in fact extremely significant. Mark wrote his gospel for the Christian community in Rome. If he mentioned Alexander and Rufus by name, it is because they were known to that community. The readers would know who they were, and indeed when Paul wrote his letter to the Romans, he greeted a man named Rufus, calling him chosen in the Lord, and mentioned Rufus's mother, saying that she had been like a mother to Paul himself. If this Rufus is the same son of Simon, and most scholars believe he is, then the family of the man who carried the cross became one of the most influential families in the early church. Think about it, an African farmer who entered Jerusalem as a stranger left as the father of a lineage of faith that helped build the church. His hands, which had only known the plow, touched the most sacred wood in history. His shoulders, which had carried grain and tools, bore the instrument of human redemption. His name, which no one knew before that Friday, is pronounced in every Holy Week celebration, in every church in the world, in every language on earth. Simon of Cyrene is living proof that God doesn't choose the qualified, He qualifies the chosen. He is proof that the divine plan includes people who never applied for any spiritual position. He is proof that being in the right place, at the right time, with an open heart, can change not only your life, but the history of the world. But there is something deeper in Simon's story, something that goes beyond biography and touches the very core of Christian theology. When Simon carried Jesus' cross, he did, literally and physically, what Jesus invites every human being to do spiritually. If anyone wants to come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. Simon didn't hear this phrase, it was said earlier, during Jesus' public ministry, but he lived it. He denied himself, he gave up his day, his plans, his security. He took up the cross literally, and he followed Jesus step by step uphill to Golgotha. And what did he discover in doing so? He discovered that the cross, the most cruel instrument of death ever invented, was in fact the gateway to life. That the most crushing weight in the world was, paradoxically, the path to liberation. That carrying Christ's cross was not a burden, it was a privilege. Simon of Cyrene died as a Christian. We don't know when, we don't know where, we don't know how, but we know what matters. He died as a transformed man. A man who touched the cross and was touched by the cross. A man who helped carry the weight of redemption, and in doing so, was redeemed. His story isn't found in the great theological treatises. It doesn't occupy entire chapters in the epistles. It appears in a few verses in the Synoptic Gospels, but those few verses contain a message that reverberates for 2,000 years. God uses the unlikely. God chooses those the world ignores. God transforms burdens into blessings. And perhaps, just perhaps, as you listen to this story, God is doing the same thing with you. Perhaps the cross you are carrying now, that pain, that loss, that seemingly endless struggle, is not a punishment. Perhaps it is a calling. Perhaps it is the hand of God pointing to you in the midst of the crowd and saying, "You, come here, I have something for you." And perhaps, like Simon, you will discover that the weight that seemed to destroy you was, in fact, the weight that was shaping the person God always wanted you to be. The story of Simon didn't just happen 2,000 years ago. It happens every day. It happens every time someone is placed in a situation they didn't choose, didn't ask for, didn't plan for, and discovers in the midst of the chaos that God was there all along, using the unexpected as an instrument of transformation. How many times have you felt like Simon? Walking through life with your burden of grain, your responsibilities, your bills, your daily problems, when suddenly something unexpected happens, an illness, a loss, a betrayal, a failure, and suddenly you are carrying a weight that wasn't yours, on a road you didn't choose, towards a destination you can't see. But what if that weight is, in fact, God's invitation to something greater? What if the cross you carry is the path God has prepared to lead you exactly where He wants you to be? Simon teaches us that we don't need to be pastors, theologians, or prophets to participate in God's work. We only need to be available. We only need to say yes when the call comes, even when the call seems absurd, impossible, or painful. We only need to take the next step and the next and the next, trusting that the God who placed us on that path knows where He is leading us. Simon also teaches us about the power of encounter. He met Jesus at the worst possible time, in his moment of greatest pain, greatest humiliation, greatest weakness. And it was precisely at that moment that the transformation happened. Not on the Mount of Transfiguration, not in glorious miracles, not in eloquent sermons, on the cross, in the blood, in shared pain. Because it is in moments of greatest suffering that masks fall, that defenses crumble, that the soul is exposed. And it is in these moments that God does His most profound work. If you're carrying a cross today, look at Simon. He didn't ask to be there. He didn't understand what was happening. He had no answers to any of the questions burning inside him, but he carried it. One step at a time, one breath at a time. And at the end of the road, he discovered that the cross had led him not to death, but to life. Not to defeat, but to the greatest victory in history. May the story of Simon of Cyrene illuminate your path. May you have the courage to carry the cross that God places before you. And may you discover, at the end of the journey, as Simon discovered, that you were never carrying the cross alone. He was always there by your side, sharing the weight, guiding your steps, transforming your pain into purpose. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment on where you're watching from. May God bless you. Amen.